Welcome to the Moakley webinars, the second installment. And we will begin with an introduction and overview by Dean Kiki Dozie, who will turn it over to Parag O'Malley, who would further will begin the discussion of our topic today. So over to you, Dean Dozie.
Good evening, good afternoon, good night to all of you, wherever you are. Welcome to the second webinar on the Ukraine-Russia war. This is a MIPS seminar, which is being hosted by the John Joseph Moakley Chair of Peace and Reconciliation and the McCormack School of Policy and Global Studies. MIPS stands for McCormack Institutes of International and Public Service. Our centers and institutes and special programs like the Moakley Chair are critical to our academic mission and our public service educational model. They are a bridge to a worldwide community of connections and partnerships with public and private institutions that create meaningful intellectual and experiential exchanges for McCormack's students and faculty. They connect the theory that we teach and learn in our academic programs to real-world practices in our communities, and they provide our faculty and students with an opportunity to engage community partners in the process of co-creating knowledge in a variety of forms. My name is Rita Kiki Dozie. I'm the interim dean of the John McCormack School of Policy and Global Studies here at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I have the privilege of introducing our guests. But first, let me say a word about the Moakley Chair, which is part of the McCormack School, an integral part of the McCormack School. It was established in 2006 to honor the memory of the late Congressman John Joseph Moakley, who represented South Boston in Congress from 1973 until his death in 2001. As President Ronald Reagan's envoy to El Salvador, Congressman Moakley exposed the Salvadorian military's role in the murder of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter in 1989. As a result, Congress cut off aid to El Salvador, forcing the military in that brutal civil war to the negotiating table, which brought it to an end. Let me say a few words about Professor Parag O'Malley, who has been the Moakley Chair since the program was inaugurated here at UMass Boston's McCormack School. A close confidant of Moakley himself, he has worked across numerous conflict areas and democratic transitions for over 50 years, most notably in Northern Ireland, South Africa, Iraq, and the Middle East. He is the author of several books on Northern Ireland, South Africa, and the Middle East. His unique collection of 15 years of interviews with South Africans of every political persuasion during the transition from apartheid to a post-conflict society is hosted on the Mandela Organization's website. Professor O'Malley is the founding director of the New England Journal of Public Policy, a publication of the McCormack School. He also founded the Forum for Cities in Transition, which is dedicated to the principle that one divided society is in the best position to help another. And most recently, he founded GAIN, the Global Alliance of Muslims for Equality, to help young Muslims navigate the challenges they face in post-ISIS Europe and the United States. Park's forthcoming book, Perils, Prospects of a United Ireland, will be published this month, later on. And now let me talk about our two guests joining Parag this afternoon. They are General George W. Casey, Jr., and Ambassador Carl Eikenberry, both of whom have distinguished careers in the military, civil society, academy, and government. Time does not permit doing justice to their combined decades of honorable service, nor listing the array of decorations and honors they both have received, but here's a brief summary. General Casey, General George Casey grew up in a military family with Boston roots. His Boston-born father, George Sr., was an Army Major General who served in both the Korean War and the Vietnam War, where he commanded the US 1 Cavalry Division at the time of his death in 1970. His son is George Jr., who went on to serve for 41 years in the US Army following his graduation from Georgetown University. Now he is a retired 4-star general. George Jr. is a highly decorated and accomplished leader who remains an authority on strategic leadership. Let me move quickly to Carl Eikenberry. Carl Eikenberry is currently a faculty member of the Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University in Beijing, China, and currently specializes in Middle East security affairs. He is a former ambassador to Afghanistan, and he is Lieutenant General of the US Army, retired. From 2011 to 2019, he was the director of the US Asia Security Initiative at Stanford's Asia Pacific Research Center. While at Stanford, he was also an affiliate with the Institute for International Studies Center for International Security and Cooperation. He also served with the Center for Democracy and Development and the Rule of Law and the Europe Center. Prior to his arrival at Stanford, Eikenberry served as the US Ambassador to Afghanistan from 2009 to 2011. Before that appointment as Chief of Mission in Kabul, Ambassador Eikenberry had a 35-year career in the United States Army, retiring with the rank of Lieutenant General. He is the recipient of numerous military awards, along with foreign and international decorations. I'm going to stop there. There's so much more I can say about our panelists, but we are honored to have both Professor O'Malley and our star panelist, George Eikenberry and okay.
Hello.
We're very happy to have Ambassador Carl Eikenberry and General George Casey as our panelists. I think I'd ask that they join the panel with me, and I hand it over to Parag for a few words before I come back with some questions.
Thank you, Kiki.
Thank you.
Let me add my own gratitude to both Ambassador Eikenberry and to General Casey. And Ambassador, I looked up the pronunciation of your name. There are 98 pronunciations of your name in the English language. So I hope I've worked it out. We have one pronunciation for every decoration you received.
Well, that's that's one less pronunciation variation than your own first name.
All right.
So let me turn to Ukraine. The Ukraine-Russia war has now entered its second year, with both sides preparing for spring offensives. The battle lines more like the trench warfare swamps of World War I, where tens of thousands were killed in close combat and small amounts of territory exchanged hands at great human cost. The rules-based international order put in place after World War II is in turmoil. What might restore it or replace it is not yet clear, but whatever shape and form it takes will depend very much on how this war turns out. In the last year, the West has crossed several self-imposed red lines regarding the amount and type of weaponry it supplies to Ukraine, including just recently the decision by the US to supply the advanced Abrams tanks. More importantly, perhaps, Germany agreed, although reluctantly, to allow its allies in NATO to send a number of its highly mobile Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, an escalation Putin has vowed to respond to. In short, the opening months of 2023 see slow escalation on all fronts, or an appetite for it. Also on all fronts, both Ukraine and Russia declared nothing short of total victory as an acceptable outcome. No side is open to negotiations about ending the war. In Ukraine, both the armies and civilian morale remained extremely high. The public response was extraordinary resilience in the face of relentless bombardment. The talk is of winning the war, driving Russia out of all the territory it claims as part of the Russian Federation, including Crimea. In the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin remains obdurate. This is a civilizational and extension war, a war against Western aggression to destroy Russia. He has vowed to go to any lengths not to lose, not excluding a nuclear option if the West crosses one red line too many, or if there is a serious threat of a military defeat, or perhaps a threat to his own life. Russia has abundant manpower. Ukraine has a superior weaponry, especially US precision missiles. The question is, which will run out first in the longer run, the weaponry or the manpower? So how does this war end? What will it take to get both sides to a negotiating table? The historical record tells us that knowing you are going to lose is not an incentive to negotiate. Indeed, it often may be a trigger to escalate. November 1914, for example, Crown Councillor in Germany was the Chancellor, the Kaiser, and Chief of Staff all agreed that Germany couldn't win the war. Yet the war escalated on all fronts for another 4 years at horrific costs, millions of lives lost in senseless slaughter. Some pundits see a frozen conflict. Support for the war peaks. The post-World War II decades, Europe outsourced its security to the United States. Transitioning to a robust self-defense will be costly and not accomplished overnight. Some NATO members are already having second thoughts about parting with their Leopard tanks. Their own stockpiles are already low and could take years to replace, leaving them vulnerable to a future Russian attack. The Germans remain ambivalent. Half the population did not support sending Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. There are fissures in the relationship between Germany and Poland. NATO countries find themselves caught between giving Ukraine enough not to lose the war, but not enough to win it in any way President Zelensky wants to. The war morphs into a stalemate. In a recent UN resolution calling on Russia to withdraw from Ukraine, 47 countries, including India and China, world's most populous countries, half of Africa and much of the global South and Asia abstained. This war is not their war. The Ukrainian economy has tanked. In 2022, it contracted by 30%. Will it crash another 30% in 2023, or become a dependency of the West, reliant on massive amounts of economic aid for an indeterminate period, in addition to military hardware? On the other hand, sanctions against Russia that were supposed to cripple the Russian economy have had a limited impact. The Russian economy in 2022 contracted by less than 2%. Increasingly, countries not in the West's coalition are putting their self-interests first and finding ways to trade with Russia. Russian goods once exported to Europe are now shipped to China, blunting the impact of sanctions. India, although working with the US to counter China, relies on Russian oil. Trade with Russia has quintupled. The West may slowly push Ukraine to the negotiating table. A Republican Congress in the United States, perhaps a Republican president, could cap expenditure on military hardware for Ukraine. But the United States' commitment must be seen to be sufficiently robust and sustained to convince China that the American pledge to defend Taiwan is one that will meet the test of time, that it is not half-hearted and ready to crumble in the face of adversity. Recent signs of a closer relationship between Russia and China, with US intelligence reporting that China may be about to supply Russia with what I use mystically calls lethal aid, are a further complicating factor. The US warns China that if it is to choose sides so absolutely with Russia, there will be dire consequences. Just what does that mean? In Davos, in January, the Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin told the global elite, "We don't know when the war ends, but Ukraine has to win. I don't see another choice." But in wars, there are always other choices. What remains unclear is the end game of both protagonists. What outcome, short of either securing absolute victory, might have the makings of a compromise? The Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has moved the hand of the doomsday clock forward to 90 seconds to midnight, the closest to global catastrophe it has ever been. The clock is ticking. On this less than resoundingly optimistic note, I will turn the conversation over to General Casey.
Mike,
Thank you, Porg, and thanks for leaving it at the global catastrophe level. Kiki, thanks for the kind introduction of Carl and me. Good evening, everybody, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. I think the question that Porg posed to us, how does this war end, is one that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds as we enter the second year of the war. So what I thought I'd do to help put it in perspective for folks is start by sharing some insights that Carl and I have gained over the last 2+ years in a conversation with 4 retired Russian generals. And 3 of those conversations have been since the war began. And then I'll share a couple of broad thoughts about the military aspects of the campaign and turn it over to Carl to talk about what the political, military, and diplomatic aspects of this will look like to actually bring this war to a conclusion. So here we go. Just as I said, a little over 2 years ago, the Stimson Center, it's a think tank here in Washington, started what they call a Track 2 dialogue. And this is Track 1 being the official communications, Track 2 being unofficial communications between parties. We've been doing this on Zoom. and the Russians are participating, knowing full well that the Zoom call can be monitored by anybody in Russia. In the early sessions before the war, they were pretty candid with us. They said that they believed that the relationship between the United States and Russia was at the worst level since the Cold War, and they didn't see any real prospects for that to change in the near term. They also repeatedly expressed concern about NATO enlargement. In fact, to the point where they said that they felt lied to by our Secretary of State, James Baker, who in February 1990 promised that NATO would expand not 1 inch eastward. And they felt that this had certainly not been complied with. Russia's had these grievances for more than 30 years. And they've only continued to be inflamed by what George Kennan in 1946 in his now famous long telegram called Russia's instinctive sense of insecurity. Until 12 months ago, they had been addressing their security concerns through diplomacy, and I would say hybrid tactics that allowed them to accomplish their political objectives without encountering a forceful response from the United States or NATO. As the examples of this are the occupation of the Georgian regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia in 2009, and the occupation of the Crimea and Eastern Ukraine in 2014. Yet until 12 months ago, the United States and Russia had seemed to understand that the need for good relations to prevent direct military conflict, particularly nuclear conflict. And so we found ways to cooperate. As late as March of 2021, we agreed to continue to limit the number of deployed nuclear warheads by extending the New START agreement until 2026. Sadly, that was the agreement that was suspended, in which the Russians suspended their participation last week. A few months after we did that, it was the first Putin-Biden summit. And at the time, the summit was seen as professional, pragmatic, businesslike. In short, it was seen as about as good as the two countries could have hoped for at that time. Yet at the same time we were working things out at a diplomatic level, they were working very hard to rebuild and modernize their military. They spent about 4% of their gross domestic product a year over about a decade. That's about $70 billion a year. That sounds like a lot, but it's important we keep it in perspective, because China spends 3 times that amount and the United States spends 10 times that amount. The other thing I think it's important to keep in mind is the scale of the Russian military now. During the Cold War, the Russians, with their Warsaw Pact allies, could mass 225 mechanized infantry and armored divisions. This is the spearhead, the armored spearhead of any invasion. Today, Russian has only 22 mechanized infantry and armored divisions, and you're seeing the impact of that difference on the ground in Ukraine today. And at the same time that they were spending more money to modernize the military, they were gaining combat experience in Syria and in Eastern Ukraine. And we thought, frankly, the combination of the increased spending and that combat experience made them capable of rapid short-term actions, much like the special operations that they conducted in 1956 in Hungary and 1968 in Czechoslovakia. So candidly, we were all surprised when they didn't accomplish their objectives in Ukraine rapidly. But they significantly overestimated their own capabilities and underestimated significantly the strength and will of the Ukrainians. Napoleon, who himself was vanquished by the Russian winter, famously said, "In war, moral power is to the physical as 3 is to 4. and it's easy to see who has the moral power here. Russia clearly made some significant mistakes in the Ukraine, starting with the fact that they never had the troops to accomplish what they set out to do and take, let alone hold, the large cities. As the commander in Iraq, I had about 175,000 troops in a country that had a population of about 25 million, and my mission was not to occupy the country. Ukraine's population is 43 million, and it's 1.5 times larger than Iraq. They tried to overthrow the country with 190,000 troops attacking on a very broad front. And now they find themselves stuck and defending a 600-mile front. That's, for example, like trying to defend from St. Louis to New Orleans. In the 3 meetings we've had since the start of the war, at our first meeting, which was in April of 2022, we told the Russians that it seemed like everything that they had done in the last 60 days had produced exactly the opposite effect that the Russians intended. Russia alienated the Ukrainian population. They turned the countries of NATO and Europe against it. They pushed Sweden and Finland to seek NATO membership. They saw the positioning of more, not less, troops in Eastern Europe. They brought significant damage to their own economy, and they called into question the effectiveness and the professionalism of the Russian military. Interestingly, only one of the Russians pushed back on that. And one actually said that poor political decisions early on made the military look bad, which is about as far as he could go in criticizing Putin, who they warned us was very unpredictable when he was cornered. In our second session last October, they told us that the Russian goals in the region had been met, that all they needed to do now was to start negotiations to fix these new borders. They had accomplished that land bridge that linked Crimea to Russia. They told us that those regions now, those 4 oblasts, are now part of Russia, and they cannot be turned to the Ukraine because the annexation was approved by the Russian Duma, and they are now constitutionally Russian. They asked us to help get the Ukrainians to the negotiating table. We demurred, and we told them that it's the Ukraine's goal to defeat the Russians and to restore their boundaries, and it's the United States and NATO's goal to help them do that. We continually pressed them on what would make them feel secure enough to stop the fighting, because they kept telling us that Ukraine was threatening their security. I would say they told us this very disingenuously. They finally told us that what Russia wants is a neutral, non-NATO, non-nuclear Ukraine, which puzzled us because that's what they had before the war started. We also talked about nuclear weapons, and they told us that Russia does not intend to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They believe, as do we, that there couldn't be a limited nuclear war between the United States and Russia without leading to mutually assured destruction, and something that they don't want any more than we do. They actually said it was the West's historical reaction to Putin's comments on nuclear weapons that raised the threat to the Cuban Missile Crisis levels that Pori mentioned earlier. We told them that any U.S. response to their use of nuclear weapons would be catastrophic for them, and that we needed to work together to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. Our last meeting with them was less than a month ago, and we took on the issue of how do we get from where we are today to a new security order in Europe where all the countries can feel secure within their own borders. We told them that we believe that the current conflict was basically frozen along that 600-mile front that runs from just east of Kharkiv in the Donbass all the way down to the Black Sea near Kherson. And we believe that neither side has the military forces sufficient to appreciably change that to the point where decisive victory could be achieved. Russia believes, though, that this war of attrition that they currently face, that they believe they can outlast the Ukraine supported by our Western allies. We believe that Russia made a significant miscalculation as to both the ability of the Ukrainians to defend themselves and NATO allies' resolve to protect their security. In our discussions, 4 scenarios came up for the end of the war. The first one was Russia prevails and puts a Russia-friendly government in Kyiv. For the reason I already mentioned, I believe that's possible, but not very likely. Second is a ceasefire that leads to diplomatic efforts to resolve the boundaries between the two countries. I frankly believe this is possible, but I think how long it will take us for the diplomatic efforts to succeed is unknowable, but I do know that it won't happen quickly. To give you a historical perspective, in Korea, it took 2 years from the time the front stabilized for the armistice to be signed. So even if they get a ceasefire, this is going to drag on for a long time. Third is the frozen conflict that Padraig mentioned. I frankly think the conflict already is frozen, and it's frozen along that 600-mile front. I suspect it's going to stay frozen for all of 2003 and probably into 2004 before either side will be moved to some type of ceasefire and the start of negotiations. Then the fourth course of action is Ukraine prevails and reasserts its control over all or most of all the territories they lost in 2014. I also believe that this is possible, although not very likely for the reasons that I said. The Russians made it clear to us that Putin and Russia are in this for the long haul. And it's clear Russia has the industrial capacity and the resources to sustain this for a long time. And I think the mobilization that they conducted in September, as fragmented as it was, is a good indication of this. Putin is clearly hoping for a fracturing of the Western alliance that will pressure Ukraine to the negotiating table. There's an old Leninist maxim: when you strike steel, pull back. When you strike mush, press on. Putin needs to feel steel. He cannot succeed or seem to be succeeding, not just to prevent the Russians from future actions, but to deter China and other nuclear armed states from similar actions. And with that, I will turn it over to Carl for the political, military, and the diplomatic side.
Thanks. So thanks to the McCormack School. Thanks, Dina Adoze, and thank you, Dr. O'Malley. And it's great to be sharing the platform here with General George Casey, who in my mind is one of the greatest soldiers of this 21st century. And I know, George, that you probably feel the same way that I do, that having spent the first 2 decades of our military service thinking about how to deter a Red Army attack on Europe, that it's stunning that 3 decades after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, here we sit in this McCormack School forum talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is now totally consuming NATO and consuming the transatlantic alliance, but so it is. So I'd like to supplement Dr. O'Malley's very good introduction and General Casey's words with some thoughts on the 4 critical actors right now involved in this conflict with regard to what are their goals, their strategies, and some of the vulnerabilities that they're facing. And that, of course, would be Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and Europe. I'll try to be brief. And then a few other words about China and the so-called global South. And hopefully between George and myself with these introductory remarks, setting the stage for a good discussion Q&A. So first of all, with regard to Russia, and General Casey and Dr. O'Malley already laid it out pretty well, that this is very much Putin's war, and that it's a war that has a long history in Russia that precedes it. It's a war in his mind and many of the Russian people's mind, I think, to make Russia whole again and to reconstitute the greatness of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. This idea that the Russia is historically besieged, now currently by the West. So this is an idea that it's really making Russia whole. It's a defensive war. It's a just war. Not talked about enough in my mind. There's another aspect to this war, and that Putin, a strong autocrat, fearful of democracy and political pluralism, when he's seen it on his borders, which have been traditional Russian spheres of influence, he moves decisively against it. So I think his fear of Ukraine actually goes back to the Maidan revolution of 2014, and he would not tolerate a free and democratic Ukraine on his border. And then a third point tied into this second point, this war providing him with the opportunity then to consolidate power within Russia, albeit I agree with George, he terribly miscalculated. So for Putin, then, a successful prosecution of this war is an existential matter to him and his survival. But the question is, what's a successful war? And it's not clear that Putin knows or any of us know. At the outset, it seemed clear that his goal was the elimination of Ukraine as a sovereign state, and at a minimum to create a puppet state on his border. But as George had mentioned, now it seems that his goals may be changing, but we don't know. Is he satisfied now to annex, having annexed the 4 eastern provinces, to consolidate control, get a negotiated settlement, and use this as an opportunity then to reset and use diplomatic, information, military, economic means to continue the assault against Ukraine and have another phase? I agree with George that he thinks the time is on his side. He sees correctly that the center of gravity, and we heard this from our Russian interlocutors, they view the center of gravity as US and Western support for Ukraine. So how can they try to, then how can Moscow attack that center of gravity? You try to convince then Europe and the Americans that the cost of this war is too high. You emphasize the price of military and economic assistance. You hint that the risk of escalation are always out there, that prospect of going nuclear. You try to prove the hopelessness of the Ukrainian military cause, and you work hard to sow divisions within the US body politic, Western politics, and between the United States and the EU and NATO. And there's a part of Putin that, of course, then assumes that history is on his side, that there's a historical trend where the West is in decline, and he's on the right side of history here. His strategy is on the battlefield, but there's, as I talked about, a political strategy against Ukraine. There's an economic strategy. Some people have talked about this war has got an Eastern military front, a Southern military front, and a third front's the economic front. And his brutal attacks on Ukrainian economic infrastructure is aimed at trying to collapse the Ukrainian economy and destroy the will of the Ukrainian people. He's also trying to show that he's open to negotiations, and at the same time, he continues to make an appeal to the global South and to China. Important for him to continue economic exchange and cast the West as the real culprits in this conflict. He does have vulnerabilities. We can talk about those during the Q&A. And I know George would have some keen thoughts on that, but there is one vulnerability for Russia that is important. I could mention two. One, long-term economic, not short-term, but longer-term he is facing some real challenges if this war were to go on 2-3 years and the sanctions would stay in place. And then a second vulnerability is with regard potentially to the from the Russian elite over the long term, not from the people. He's got good control of the people with his security apparatus, but the Russian elite feeling that their well-being long term was under threat. In fact, the security of the Russian nation was under threat because of Putin's miscalculations. More briefly, with regard to Ukraine, then goals that they have. The restoration of Ukrainian territory, but secondly, in related, but thinking about these two separately, is that wherever the boundaries are when this war is over, whether or not it's those 4 provinces included or something less than the full restoration of sovereignty, most important perhaps to Zelensky and the Ukrainian people is whatever they have, credible security guarantees from Russia and the West, which for now, I think the only credible security guarantees for the Ukrainian people would be EU membership and probably NATO membership, or at least close affiliation. At the same time, Ukraine pushing hard and Zelensky pushing hard to the extent he can to weaken Putin's influence within Russia, and then the preservation of the Zelensky administration. And that 4th goal is important when you start to consider then negotiations. So to achieve this, then, the Ukrainians emphasizing the maintenance of US and European diplomatic, military, and financial support, the way that they try to maintain that support, they've got to show success on the battlefield. They've got to be able to project an image to the West and to the world that they have a coherent and a popular and accountable governance, casting the Russian aggression as an existential threat to Europe and to democracies globally. And then on the global stage, trying to make clear that this is a war about global order and the preservation of global order and stability, and a war against Russian imperialism, as I would agree with Dr. O'Malley that they're having difficulties on that front. And then as well, show openness towards negotiations. Their vulnerabilities is perhaps if they stall on the battlefield, then losing that Western support, the mounting cost and flagging interest in the West, and then finally Ukrainian morale and political cohesion and economic viability. For the United States, goal is the defense of Ukrainian sovereignty, but unclear what the end state actually is. What is the ultimate US goal here? I think at this point, it's easier to state US goals in terms of what the US seeks to avoid. So an outcome in which it's perceived that Russia was able to seize and annex portions of the Ukrainian state with an outcome that leads to an inherently unstable Eastern Europe. A second has been mentioned by both George and Dr. O'Malley to avoid a precedent that emboldens China in East Asia. A third is the avoidance of nuclear war. And a fourth, for US domestic politics, avoiding and what we perceived as a growing, endless, open-ended, costly, long-term military and financial obligation. And our vulnerabilities, I think, are clear. Political unity as we approach the 2024 election, maintaining transatlantic unity, the narrative battle within the global South, trying to get support for sanctions, and then fourth and finally, US energy policy, whether it can adapt to support long-term efforts with regard to this conflict. And then lastly, for Europe, many goals very consistent with the United States, but European politics are very fractious, as is our own. And you have divides in Europe between the East and the West of Europe, You have divides within European countries themselves with rightist and populist politics that are more sympathetic to Russia. Their own vulnerabilities, political cohesion and will, their willingness to maintain an increase in defense spending and in increasing their defense industrial base, their support long-term for Ukrainian economic assistance, and finally, trying to reduce their dependence on Russian energy, this last year being rather surprising and some pretty good signs there. Let me finish by just mentioning China and the global south. First of all, with regard to China, diplomatically, they portray themselves globally as neutral, but of course, they're very aligned strategically with Russia, and they see this conflict between Russia and Ukraine right now very much in terms of competition with the United States. They have a shared worldview of Putin, of the dangers posed by democracies and this notion of a decline in the West. They use this war, they would see this war as useful as an offset against the United States, which was trying to concentrate militarily and diplomatically in Asia, and now having shifted back to Europe, pins the United States down, an effort, an opportunity the Chinese would think in the longer term to drive a wedge between the United States and Europe, an effort globally to make a point that the United States overuses sanctions, which they worry about should they go to a war over Taiwan, and an effort being made now with Russia and the global south to internationalize the Chinese yuan. But at the end of the day, they do worry about antagonizing the United States and Europe because they're essential to their own economic well-being and growth. They announced shortly after the Munich conference a 12-point peace plan. We can talk about that during the discussion if you'd want. It's mostly posturing. It's very short on details. And then lastly, the global south, maintaining the studious neutrality, so to speak. I'm living here right now in the Gulf region, in the Persian Gulf area, and I feel this global south critique. I hear this global south critique daily, that there's a sense of that this is not our war in the global south. There's a degree of hypocrisy coming from Western capitals, which, according to the global south narrative, have ignored conflict in the global south, but now seems to be concentrating and wants the whole world to mobilize over Ukraine. In fact, there's a degree of satisfaction I see on the streets occasionally that after decades of the West lecturing the global south about how to manage conflict, the flames now are burning in our own backyards. And then finally, the narrative that we have about autocracies versus democracies, well, suffice it to say that that doesn't resonate real well here in the Gulf countries. Let me stop there and then open it up for discussion, Q&A.
I think
Thank you so much, George and Carol. Kiki, would you like to lead off the questions?
Yes, I would. Very excited to lead off the first couple of questions. Let me start with the first. And that is going back to the title of this talk, when will this war end? I think is on everybody's mind. But you know, today's events, the G20 weren't peace talks, but there were attempts, you know, by, I believe, you know, Modi of India and others to facilitate, you know, some dialogues, you know, around a pathway to peace. But, you know, the talks ended with no consensus from various parties, given that they were holding, you know, very different views about routes to peace. And so my first question is, can you talk about these divergences to peace? What are the obstacles to peace? What are the issues that actors and parties cannot come to end this war.
Okay, I'll take a shot at it, Carl, and then you can have a go. What are the obstacles? I mean, I think several of us have mentioned the fact that Putin sees this as an existential threat to him personally. He's put an awful lot. He's got an awful lot at stake here, and so for him to back off without something significant to show for it would be a real problem for him. I think Zelensky on the other side has the same kind of problem. He can't just walk away from the lands. So it's going to take pushing from outside to get the two together. I think those political challenges are the primary detriments to resolving this crisis, and that's what happens. The wars go on until the political leaders on both sides come to a point where they say it's time to end this. Now, and I don't know that there'll be a specific event that will cause that to happen, but I think it's something that will evolve to over time. Much like the example that Porig used in World War I and the Germans. You know, the war went on for 4 years after they knew they couldn't win. Carl?
Yeah, and this question of how does it end, none of us know at this juncture. You can see different possibilities. George gave 4 very good plausible scenarios with degrees of probability with each one. But if you look at intense conflicts like this one has become the history of them, that something has got to change from what we see as the status quo right now. So one possibility is the collapse of one side or the other. So you look then at Russia in World War I, the sudden collapse of Russia, or France in World War II, which was suffering military defeats, but at the end there was a political collapse that occurred as well. So is it possible that one side or the other could have a collapse? The second would be a shock that occurs, which changes the complexion of the battlefield and changes everything strategically. So Russia uses a tactical nuclear weapon, or there's a political regime change in a capital that was not anticipated. The third, and what people would say is the most likely right now, is then the emergence of some kind of herding stalemate in which both sides conclude that that they've gone as far as they can. There's no further great advantage to be had by continued prosecution of a military campaign, and that they then come together in the battlefield. And as General Casey had pointed out, the Korean War being a very good example of that very fluid battlefield, and then the battlefield reached a stalemate between the North and the South, and it still took 2 years of negotiations to reach the settlement. So politically informed at the end of the day was that armistice agreement. But too long of answer to the question. I think that there are some independent variables that are out there, some surprises that will occur that will finally open the pathway towards some kind of diplomatic settlement.
Thank you. I just want to follow up, and I see some questions out there, but this question specifically is for you, George, because you have said that you have actually gotten input and feedback from a cohort of Russian generals. That's fantastic. But I was reading a really fascinating, although controversial article this morning by I think he's a historian of the McCormack School of Economics, Vlad Zubov. But he was saying the same thing, that he has, a cohort of, Russian generals that he's talking to, and they have floated some appeasement ideas, for peace. And, some of those, mechanisms would be to lift off sanctions and, integrate, Russia, back into the global society. And he acknowledges that, he's being criticized for that, as sort of Russian appeasement and, letting Russia off the hook for its aggression. But he maintains that, if we want peace, we should consider, those strategies. So I was just wondering what you think.
Yeah, and I would point out, Carl is part of those discussions. He's one of the 4 Americans, so he's in on this too. It's interesting. In the last discussions we had, the ones less than a month ago, they all 3, there were only 3 of them on that time, but they pressed us and to say that we need to stop the fighting now. We need to stop the fighting now. And they quoted General Leonid Ivashov, who is a retired Russian 3-star who has been publicly calling for a ceasefire in Russia to his own detriment. But it just, when you mentioned sanctions, and to your earlier question about, what takes so long. So we're happy to talk as soon as you lift the sanctions. We're happy to talk as soon as you move your forces back out of the territory that you're occupying. I mean, all those things have to take place before you even get to the table, and that's why this is going to go on for I think another couple of years before we see some significant move to stop it.
Yes, Carl, please feel free to respond.
No, George captured that very well.
Paul, do you want me to take some of the questions in the audience now? I do still have a few more, but let's take some questions from the audience and then come back to ours. Is that right? Okay. All right. So I see a question from Layla Pellick.
Yes. In listening to the discussions, there was a mention of Russian imperialism. There was no mention of Western imperialism, and the discussions seemed to gloss over the idea that the US is trying to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine, which I think requires interrogation. I believe that it's a narrative we keep hearing in the mainstream media, but I think it's quite debatable, and I would like to know what the US is doing, in this war, because I have heard, and is Zelensky, there was mention that Russia wants a puppet state on its border. Could we say that Zelensky's Kiev is a puppet state of the West? And does Ukraine need a leader who will be able to not be a puppet and will be able to work with both the West and Russia and put Ukraine first, but be able to work with both these powers? And also, to me, the Ukraine-Russia crisis seems like a bad divorce. When people, they were once one country, and now they have become 2 countries, and there is a fight about who will have what. For example, in Sevastopol, Russia always had their naval bases there. Crimea was given to Ukraine when Russia,
the question, please.
When Russia and Ukraine were one country. So no one seems to be talking about the complexities of these territorial disputes, not just here, but elsewhere too, so if you could respond to what I just said. I'm not.
Thank you, Layla. Thank you. George or Carl?
You first this time, Carl.
Well, it's a great question. It's an important question. And I think in the interest of time, we may perhaps be briefer here because this you can have a 1-week seminar on the Russian view of where the historical boundaries are. You can have a long debate. George had talked in his opening remarks about NATO expansion as it went eastward. Did this then cause the inherent insecurity in the Russian state then to lead to his aggression against Georgia, his aggression against Ukraine? There was a great debate in the United States in the 1990s about the wisdom of NATO expansion. But the fact is that the expansion did go on, and it would be hard to conceive in a legal sense using international standards of sovereignty, looking at the UN Charter. It would just be very, very difficult, I think, to objectively conclude that Putin's assault against Ukraine was anything but naked aggression, an attempt to overturn the sovereignty of Ukraine. It's not a question in my mind of the, what Zelensky's particular political preferences are. Predating the assault against Ukraine was several years of writing of Putin, where he said that the Ukraine state was a fiction and that it was part of Mother Russia. Most of the world would disagree with that. Certainly the Ukrainian people disagreed with it, and that's why they're fighting so hard. For the United States, what are we trying to accomplish? I think I tried to articulate what the goals were as I see them right now for the US. But the stakes are rather high, that you've had this affront to the UN Charter and to the sovereignty of Ukraine, and that it has consequences not only for Ukraine, it has consequences for the security of Europe, it has global consequences. So I think that the law is on the United States side, and that it's a effort that is, I think, well-grounded in terms of international law. And I think it's well-grounded in terms of trying to bring order to global security.
Thank you. Dr. Barry Bluestone.
Thank you, Kiki. I have a very brief question. To what extent, there have been reports in the papers recently of protests within Russia against the war. And of course, you've also mentioned there may be some disagreements within the military in Russia. To what extent do you think those protests, both within the population and within possibly the military itself, might have an impact on making this war a shorter term one than both of you seem to think?
I'll take a whack at that. If it does have an impact, it's going to take a long time for it to happen.
Okay.
I mean, right now the polls that I've seen say 70% of the Russian population supports what's going on. It is interesting, though, to see that most of that is in the older part of the population. That the younger population, only about 40% of them support the operation. And as sanctions now continue to bite, Russia's going to have to move more money away from domestic programs to fund their military. And this is going to create some anxiety within the Russian population. Add to that the casualties and the impact that will have. In fact, the Russians generals told us that the casualty backlash would be the most significant thing that would cause the population to turn against what's going on.
It's interesting looking at these reports, some protest or disagreements within Russia and disagreements within the leadership. At a minimum, what this does is that it reduces their military effectiveness. So you look at the arguments that seem to be going on with the Russian military high command and the Wagner group. This can't be too inspirational for the soldiers in the ranks as they look up and see this disunity. And as George had also said, the morale factor is an important one. The second is that although everyone is confident that Putin's got very good control of the domestic security within his country, by the way, the cost of this war is not only his military cost, but it's increasing costs for the security apparatus as well. But the longer term economic trends, I don't think are positive. It's true that Russian economic growth, the Russian economy only declined by about 2 or 3% last year. In fact, there's expectation that it may marginally increase this year. But last year was also perhaps an anomaly. So you had energy prices, which have now declined by about 50% since the harvest of last year. And the Russian break-even cost for its oil, they're getting close to that as the price of Euro crude continues to go down. Also, they had the effect then with all of that money coming in and a pretty good war chest to begin with to actually increase welfare spending, but they can't afford that anymore. They were already facing a healthcare crisis and their economy was already stalling. So you've got that at work. The West, with its sanctions, they have proven to be unsurprisingly pretty porous, but there has been a net effect on technology transfers. And longer term, that's going to not only impair the Russian military, but it's going to impair their capacity for further economic growth. And then lastly is already they had a demographic challenge that they were facing before this war, but now with this war, they've got conscription. So you pull all those young men and you put them in uniform, they're not there productive in the economy. And then very importantly is the flight of human capital from Russia. We don't know what the numbers are. It's been estimated 500,000. Some have put it as high as 1 million. But those fleeing, a lot of them are the young, best and the brightest in the future of Russia. So none of this means a collapse in Russia over the next month or 12 months or several years, but it does start to take a toll. And at some point in time, whether it's the military high command or the political elite or the business tycoons, do they have conversations behind closed doors that force Putin to change course or worse, that maybe best for others, that Putin is removed from power?
Thank you. I see Farzin and Dietrich, and you are going to be up next, but I just want to interject, another question for Carl and George. And this, goes back to the, the global, geopolitical, realignment, that is happening as a result of this war. So we've got, curiously, I mean, some are saying it's a new Cold War, although, that sort of doesn't capture, the complexity of the realignments here. We've got the US and Ukraine on one side, and, China and, supporting Russia on the other side. So could you both speak to, the state of global peace and security, given, the resolution of this Russia-Ukraine war? Okay. Especially the China factor. I mean, one of you, I think, has the expertise on US-China relations, but maybe speak to what is happening. Is the question that we all have.
So I had an opportunity to attend this year's Munich Security Conference, the annual gathering in Munich in the Bavarian state. I think it's been a tradition now for about 20 years. And it's a 3-day conference where the core probably being transatlantic, but it's very global, and long discussions with global leaders being present and different think tanks appearing about the state of security in the world. So no surprise, this year was dominated by Russia, Ukraine. And the Chinese former foreign minister, who actually with the latest change in the Communist Party's leadership at their 20th Party Congress, was promoted from foreign minister to state counselor in charge of foreign affairs. So he's the foreign policy czar, Wang Yi. He made an appearance at Munich, and he gave a speech about his thinking of the Russian-Ukraine war. And he was trying to appear to be very statesmanlike and seeking a solution to the conflict. And I have to tell you that, setting my American bias aside, that talking to my European colleagues afterwards, it was a spectacular failure on his part. That as he tried to project an image that we're here interested in world peace, and what we need is now an immediate ceasefire. He, not at Munich, but then several days later, announced a 12-point peace plan, which I mentioned in my opening remarks. And in that peace plan, there are several interesting parts about it that are useful. He said one about strategic stability, and specifically that nuclear weapons should not be used and a nuclear conflict cannot be won, going back to Reagan's maxim. So helpful there. And helpful in that he said when this war is over, that we need to be thinking about Ukrainian reconstruction. But at the same time, part of his 12-point plan, which wasn't really a plan, it was just a set of maxims and principles, which we've heard from Beijing since the war began. So ideas such as we need to end the Cold War mentality. Well, that was specifically focused at the United States and Europe, that alliances are bad, that alliances are what really caused this whole problem to begin with. He said, respect the sovereignty of all countries. Well, okay, but even as he's saying that we have a special friendship with Russia, we need to respect sovereignty. So this plan is rather empty in that regard. The idea about ceasing hostilities immediately without a plan to back it up. So cease hostilities, that's clearly in Russia's favor. You've got a frozen conflict at that time. And I could stop unilateral sanctions. That was clearly aimed at the United States and Europe. So China are trying to make an effort on the global stage to show that they're the peacemakers, that this is, that they're taking a very balanced view. But the fact is they remain very strategically aligned with Russia. 3 weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, Putin and President Xi in Beijing on the eve of the Winter Olympics signed a declaration saying we have a friendship that knows no bounds. And 3 weeks later, Russia invades Ukraine.
Yeah.
So there was a concern then that's being expressed at that Munich conference by the Europeans, and a continuing concern in the transatlantic alliance that China is using this conflict to their strategic advantage. And if there's any bright spot here, it's that the Chinese came out of their COVID lockdown a couple of weeks before the Munich conference, about 2 months before the Munich conference. So now their think tanks and their diplomats, they're getting out and about the world. And I have to say that in some of the track 2 dialogues that I had on the margins of Munich, that the Chinese think tank representatives, very savvy, but they had been under lockdown for a couple of years. They were stunned with the sharp pushback they got from the Europeans in their own Track 2 dialogues. So I think they've grossly undermanaged. Putin got the war wrong with miscalculations in terms of what he would be able to achieve very quickly. I think the Chinese during the lockdowns have badly miscalculated the European and the American reaction to this war. So with the opening, I think there's a possibility that they may start to change their views, or maybe at least the rhetoric will change.
Okay. I'm going to let, Parag has a question, but I know that Faraz and Dietrich have had their hands up. Fazin, I'm sorry, have had their hands up for a while.
Yeah.
Parag, what's the question?
Yeah. So
Hello,
basically,
let me ask you,
okay.
Hold on, Fazin. Parag,
Yeah.
let Parag just make a comment, a quick comment. Parag, go ahead.
yes, let me ask you, the United States has said that if China provides, quote unquote, lethal aid to Russia, there will be, quote unquote, dire consequences. One, what might those consequences be? And B, China could impose dire consequences of its own. And one small example, like 70% of pharmaceuticals have some ingredients that come from China, including all of the bufferin that we swallow. So what could happen here?
Okay. I'll ask you, Carl and George, to just hold on that question. Let me take one from Fazin and one from Dietrich, and then you can respond to all three. Fazin, go ahead.
Yes, so basically what I hear is a lot of old, tired cliches. My question is, are there any institutions in the United States that are not so intellectually ossified that can produce fresh new ideas? Where do we go to? Who do we talk to if we want to just completely break from this and invent a new paradigm? Because this paradigm has already failed over and over and over again. And just to come here and hear all the same things, I mean, you're just looping, you know, you're just recycling decade after decade, things that have just no validity for problem solving. Where do we go for fresh new ideas?
Thank you, Fazin. Do you have any fresh new ideas of your own?
Oh, absolutely. I'll call you about that.
All right. Thank you. Dietrich. Dietrich, are you still, Dietrich Bilger, do you still want to ask a question? Your hand is up. All right, Carl and George, I'll let you answer Parag and Fazin's questions.
I'd like to ask Farzin, what paradigm is he talking about?
Fazin, we can do a dialogue here. Fazin, did you get that? No. Okay. Continue, George.
Okay, I'll go to Porg's question. Although Carl's the China expert, but what would we do if China provided lethal aid? I think we'd have to be very careful about that. You know, I've been thinking back to the support that Russia supplied to North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and we wouldn't bomb Haiphong Harbor because we didn't want to hit the Russian ships that were providing lethal aid to the Vietnamese. So, and on the flip side of it, we and NATO have been providing lethal aid to the Ukraine. So I think we would be very careful in choosing what we did. If we did something to China, I suspect it would be more along the economic lines than it would be by certainly anything at all military.
Yeah, I would
Please,
agree
yes.
I agree with what you laid out, George. In fact, I have to say I'm a bit surprised that the emphasis that the United States has put on the red lines here. Those red lines giving lethal aid, boy, making the intelligence case that there's proof positive that they've crossed such a red line, a hard case to make. And what they have done by making now this a red line, they have ensured that you've given within the United States in our domestic political debate, you've given red meat, so to speak, to the opposition, who will look for any indicators of Chinese assistance to the Russians. What this State Councilor Wang Yi, in one of his meetings in the European capitals, he had fired back to a European counterpart that, you're talking about red lines to us. Look what the United States and Europe are providing to Ukraine. What would the United States do? Probably the United States will, if anything, would use this mostly to try to shore up European solidarity with the United States in dealing with countering China, and probably try to the extent that they could to pull other allied partners in the Asia Pacific region into that.
Just to follow up with, the sentiment, I guess, of Farzan's questions, and sort of returning back to, the questions of, we define it as global South ambivalence, to this war, but maybe, that's the wrong term. Maybe there are, differences of opinion on how they, view the war and, the peace, that we're not, sort of speaking to. I'm just wondering whether both of you could, think about that. In terms of paradigms, for example, I wonder, is it considered, would it be considered a weakness if the Biden administration developed a peace plan of its own? Or would it be a sign of strength?
I'll take a bite at that. I mean, just on the last question, I mean, I think they could, but in talking with the Russians, what they want to have is somebody like China or India or the United Nations involved. Anything we presented to them would be seen as completely biased. But back to that issue on the quote new paradigm. And in your comment about the new Cold War, Russia and China both feel that they have been disrespected, for want of a better word, by the West, and they are both looking to frame a new world order that is not necessarily tie them to living with the world order that the West has put in place since World War II. And I think this conflict in Ukraine and how it comes out and how it's resolved will have a significant influence and impact on where that goes. And so I think we are, whatever this new Cold War looks like, I think the outcome of this war will have a significant impact on reshaping what the international order is after this is done.
Great. Thank you. What about you, Carl?
I guess we're getting close to the wrap-up time here. The question of a new global order, that's not going to be the starting point of a solution to the war in Ukraine. Trying to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end, it has to be informed by a new European security architecture and has to be consistent with that. And then perhaps a new European security architecture is part of informing a new global order. But look, at the end of, at the beginning of World War I, the tragedy that unfolded was not for the lack of very intelligent statesmen. It was a problem that confounded them and they were unable to solve. So again, the starting point here in this Russia-Ukraine war, that its solution is some kind of new order that's going to be developed. I think history would disprove that that's going to be a pathway to success. On the other hand, as I said in my opening remarks, that we shouldn't be discouraged with the possibility of diplomacy, that Putin, maybe he would be satisfied with the 4 eastern provinces. And could you conceive of an outcome in which Zelensky and the Ukrainian people were convinced that the agreement that was reached, which gave them enough credible security guarantees from Europe, from NATO, and actually from Russia, that that would be a settlement which is preferable to the status quo ante.
Thank you so much. I have one last question, Paul, if you don't mind, and then we'll wrap it up. You know, still on peace, after all, the theme of this panel is, when will this war end? And so who do you think, I'm asking Carl and George, who do you think will be the best brokers of peace from this list? Modi of India, Erdogan, Turkey, Xi Jinping, you know, China, Biden, the US, or Antonio Guterres of the UN? And elaborate.
Yeah, well, my own view is at this point, the best and perhaps the only brokers of peace are Zelensky and Putin.
Thank you.
Can I finish with just a thought on what might emerge is, and I'm using the conflict in Northern Ireland as an example, not that the scale of the two conflicts are in any way the same. But what they did was they crafted ultimately a peace agreement that allowed both sides to claim victory.
Mm.
And even though over the last 25 years, each side has said, my interpretation is correct, your interpretation is wrong, and there have been quarrels about what one clause or another means, it has held the hold to no violence. Violence has not returned. And maybe in the end in Ukraine, you need an agreement where there can be the saving of face, where Putin thinks and can say to his people, we won, we secured Russia, and where Ukraine can say, we are secure, we won, we stopped them. And I just say that because on April the 8th, it's the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement.
Mm.
And many people are surprised that it has lasted that long and been that effective.
I think you need to get to work.
George.
I think you need to get to work on this, Borg.
Save the world.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Kiki.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Paul.
everybody.
Yeah.
Let me also
Thank
add
you.
my thanks to Judge Casey and Carl Eichenberry. What a fascinating, informative, you know, really quite thrilling discussion of a very difficult topic. You know, so thank you both so much.
Thanks, Dean. Thanks,
Thank you.
Dr. Melly. George,
Yep.
thanks.
Bye-bye. Yep, thank you.